January 7, 1945. The Ardennes Forest. Western Front. ***. The snow fell in silence, thick and unbroken, coating the shattered pines and frozen mud of the Ardennes in a blanket that muffled even the memory of gunfire. In a makeshift prisoner-of-war collection point near the Belgian village of Stavelot, a column of German soldiers stood in ragged formation, their field-gray uniforms torn and stained, their faces hollowed by exhaustion and something deeper, something that looked like the slow draining of belief itself. They had surrendered 3 days earlier, part of the collapsing southern flank of Operation Wacht am Rhein, what the Americans would come to call the Battle of the Bulge. They had been told this offensive would split the Allied armies, that it would drive the Americans back to the sea, that it would turn the tide of a war already lost in all but name. Instead, they stood here, watching American soldiers move with a casual efficiency that seemed to mock everything they had been taught about their enemies. The wind carried the smell of diesel fuel and wet canvas. In the distance, the rumble of engines grew louder, a mechanical thunder that rolled through the winter air like an approaching storm. The German prisoners turned their heads, curiosity flickering across faces that had grown numb to surprise. What emerged from the tree line made several of them laugh, a sharp, disbelieving bark of laughter that cut through the cold. Rolling toward them was a convoy of American trucks, 6x6s painted in olive drab, their canvas covers stretched tight over their cargo beds. But these were no ordinary supply trucks. Mounted on their flatbeds, visible even from a distance, were what appeared to be small wooden structures, crude boxes with pipes extending from their roofs, steam rising in lazy columns into the frozen sky. One of the prisoners, a sergeant from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, turned to his neighbor and muttered something in German. His companion grinned, the first genuine expression of amusement he'd shown in weeks. Showers. The Americans were bringing showers to the front. Not ammunition, not reinforcements, not even food, but showers. The absurdity of it seemed to confirm everything they'd been told about American softness, about an army of spoiled children playing at war, about soldiers who couldn't fight without their creature comforts. The laughter spread down the line, quiet at first, then louder, a release of tension that bordered on hysteria. Here they were, survivors of one of the most brutal winters in European memory, soldiers who had marched on frozen feet and slept in holes scraped from permafrost, and the Americans were worried about cleanliness. It was, in that moment, the most German thing imaginable, to laugh at the enemy's weakness, to find in their luxury the proof of inevitable decay. But laughter, like so many things in war, has a short half-life. As the trucks rolled closer and the American guards began organizing the prisoners into processing groups, the German soldiers began to understand that what they were witnessing was not weakness at all. It was something far more terrifying. It was abundance so vast, so incomprehensible, that it could afford to waste resources on comfort in the middle of a war zone. What they were seeing, though they could not yet name it, was the physical manifestation of an industrial capacity so immense that it rendered their entire understanding of warfare obsolete. To understand the moment when that laughter died, to grasp the full weight of what those German soldiers experienced as they watched steam rise from mobile shower units in a frozen Belgian forest, one must first understand what they had expected war to be, and what the reality of fighting America had revealed instead. The German soldier of 1945 was not the triumphant warrior of 1940. He was not the man who had goose-stepped through Paris or raised the swastika over the Acropolis. He was, in most cases, a conscript born in the late 1920s, a boy who had grown up in the shadow of Nazi ideology, educated in schools where maps showed a greater Germany stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals, where every lesson in history and biology and even mathematics had been bent toward a single purpose, the glorification of strength, sacrifice, and the Führer's vision of racial destiny. He had been taught that Germans were harder than other peoples, that they could endure more, sacrifice more, that their will was forged in a crucible of discipline and deprivation that soft, democratic nations could never match. This was not mere propaganda. It was doctrine, repeated so often and so thoroughly that it had become indistinguishable from observable reality. And for years, that doctrine had been confirmed by experience. The German Wehrmacht had conquered nations with shocking speed, had destroyed armies that outnumbered it, had demonstrated a tactical flexibility and operational excellence that left observers stunned. The secret, they believed, was not just superior training or better commanders. It was character, the unique German capacity for endurance, for accepting hardship as the price of victory. A German soldier could march 30 miles and fight at the end of it. He could survive on black bread and ersatz coffee. He could sleep in a ditch and wake ready to kill. This was what made him superior, what made Germany invincible despite being outnumbered, despite fighting on multiple fronts, despite the gathering material weight of the Allied powers. The Americans, by contrast, were everything Germany was not, or so the story went. They were soft, undisciplined, motivated only by money and comfort. They were a mongrel nation, racially mixed, lacking the unity of blood and soil that gave the German people their strength. Their soldiers, it was said, were boys who had never known hardship, who came from a land of plenty and would crumble the moment that plenty was taken away. They relied on machines because they lacked the spirit to fight man-to-man. They hid behind artillery and air power because they were cowards at heart. This was the message in the newsreels, in the training lectures, in the casual conversations of officers who had fought in North Africa or Italy. Yes, the Americans had numbers, men and tanks and planes in quantities that seemed impossible, but numbers meant nothing without the will to use them. The German soldier had will. The American had only wealth, and wealth could not win wars. By January of 1945, this narrative had taken on a desperate quality, because the evidence against it had become overwhelming. The German soldiers who survived the Ardennes offensive had seen things that didn't fit the story they'd been told. They had watched American units take catastrophic casualties and come back stronger days later, fresh divisions appearing as if from nowhere. They had called down artillery barrages on American positions, only to have those positions respond with counter-battery fire so massive and so precise that entire German gun lines were obliterated in minutes. They had destroyed American tanks in numbers that should have crippled any offensive, only to see new tanks, better tanks, Shermans with wider tracks and bigger guns, rolling forward the next morning as if the losses meant nothing at all. It was this last realization that had begun to break something in the German soldiers' understanding of war. Not that the Americans were better fighters. Many German veterans still believed man for man they were superior, but that the Americans existed in a different kind of war entirely, one where losses could be replaced faster than they could be inflicted, where the gap between need and supply had been eliminated so completely that it might as well be magic. The mobile shower units were Exhibit A in a trial that had been underway since Normandy. They were technically designated as quartermaster sterilization and bath units, part of a logistics apparatus that most armies in history would have considered insane to even contemplate. Each unit consisted of a truck-mounted boiler capable of heating water to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, connected to a frame structure that could accommodate 32 men at a time in 8 shower stalls. The entire system could be set up in under 2 hours and could process up to 300 men per hour, providing each with 7 minutes of hot water and a complete change of clothing drawn from mobile laundry units that traveled in the same convoy. The purpose was not luxury, it was medical. Command had learned in North Africa and Italy that soldiers who couldn't bathe became casualties from disease and parasitic infection at rates that rivaled combat losses. Trench foot, body lice, dysentery, these weren't just discomforts, they were force multipliers for the enemy. The solution was characteristically American: industrialize hygiene, turn cleanliness into a logistics problem with an engineering solution, and deploy it at scale. By the winter of 1945, the U.S. Army was operating over 600 mobile bath units across the European theater, processing tens of thousands of soldiers per day. This was in addition to the fixed bath facilities being set up in every town and city as it was liberated, In addition to the quartermaster laundry units washing millions of pounds of clothing per week, in addition to the regular resupply of soap, towels, razors, and toothpaste that was considered as essential as ammunition. The average American soldier on the Western Front in 1945 showered once every 4 to 6 days, received fresh underwear and socks weekly, and had access to dental care, optometry, and medical screening on a schedule that would have been unthinkable in any previous war. This wasn't because Americans were soft. It was because American industry had produced enough of everything that it could afford to care about things beyond mere survival. The German prisoners watching those trucks arrive in January understood none of this context. What they understood was the immediate, visible fact: the Americans had brought showers to the front. The laughter came from the dissonance between that fact and everything they believed about warfare. Real soldiers didn't need showers. Real soldiers endured. The German Wehrmacht in 1945 was an army where a man considered himself lucky if he had 2 pairs of socks, where units fought over salvaged Russian felt boots because German footwear had fallen apart, where entire divisions went weeks without hot food because the supply situation had collapsed so completely that survival was a daily improvisation. And here were the Americans, in the middle of the largest battle on the Western Front, running a mobile hygiene system as if they were on a camping trip. But then the processing began, and the laughter stopped. The German prisoners were separated into groups of 50 and marched toward the shower trucks. American guards, military police mostly, directed traffic with the bored efficiency of men doing a routine task. There was no ceremony, no sense that anything unusual was happening. This was normal. This was what the American army did. The prisoners were told to strip, their clothing collected for delousing and inventory, their personal effects logged and bagged. They stood naked in the snow, hundreds of them, waiting their turn, and for the first time many of them felt the full weight of their situation. They were not just defeated, they were impoverished in ways they hadn't understood until now. The contrast between their condition and that of their captors was so stark it ceased to be merely material and became existential. When the first group emerged from the shower trucks, steam rising from their pink skin, wrapped in rough American towels and wearing clean U.S. Army-issue undergarments while their own uniforms were being processed, something shifted in the expressions of the men still waiting. It wasn't gratitude, not yet, not for most of them. It was confusion, a cognitive dissonance so profound that it manifested as a kind of stunned silence. They had expected brutality, or at worst indifference. What they received was systematic care delivered with industrial precision. And in that care was a message more devastating than any propaganda leaflet: you were never fighting an enemy you could defeat. You were fighting a system so vast, so rich, so fundamentally unconcerned with scarcity that it could afford to treat its prisoners better than your own army treated its soldiers. The symbolism of the shower would recur again and again in the testimonies of German prisoners of war, in the letters they were eventually allowed to write home, in the memoirs published decades later. It became a shorthand for a larger awakening, the moment when theory met reality and theory was found catastrophically wanting. Oberleutnant Heinrich Böll, who would later win the Nobel Prize for Literature, wrote of his own capture by American forces in April 1945. We had been taught that the Americans were weak, that their wealth was a symptom of their weakness. But wealth, we learned, is not weakness when it is wedded to will. We stood in lines for American soup and American cigarettes and American delousing powder, and we understood finally that we had been fighting not men but a machine, and the machine did not tire, did not hunger, did not doubt itself for a moment. The shower trucks at Stavelot were part of a logistics network that staggered the imagination. By the winter of 1945, the U.S. Army in Europe was consuming 800,000 tons of supplies per month. Food, fuel, ammunition, medicine, spare parts, clothing, and all the miscellaneous equipment required to keep a modern military force operational. This material arrived in an unbroken stream across the Atlantic, escorted by navies that had swept German U-boats from the sea lanes, unloaded at artificial harbors and captured ports by engineers who worked around the clock, and transported forward by truck columns that stretched for miles, headlights blazing even at night because fuel was so abundant that the risk of air attack was worth the speed gained by continuous movement. The famous Red Ball Express, the truck convoy system that supplied Allied armies after the Normandy breakout, moved 12,500 tons of supplies per day at its peak, using 6,000 trucks that burned fuel at a rate of 300,000 gallons per day. The Germans, by comparison, were supplementing their mechanized units with horse-drawn transport because they lacked the fuel for their remaining trucks. Two armies, notionally fighting the same war, but existing in different centuries of military capability. The German soldiers at Stavelot didn't know these numbers. Numbers were abstractions, and what they were experiencing was visceral and immediate. But they could count the trucks they saw, and extrapolate. If the Americans could bring showers to a temporary POW camp, what else could they bring? The answer became clear over the following days and weeks as they were processed through the system, moved to larger holding facilities, and eventually shipped to permanent camps in France or Britain or America itself. They saw field hospitals with surgical theaters and X-ray machines. They saw warehouses stacked to the ceiling with rations, each one containing more calories than a German soldier received in a week. They saw motor pools with hundreds of vehicles, many of them sitting idle as reserves, spare trucks in case other trucks broke down, a concept so alien to the German logistics system that it took time to even understand what they were seeing. Spare anything had long since ceased to exist in the Wehrmacht. Everything was scavenged, repurposed, stretched to its breaking point, and then stretched further. The food became another recurring symbol, as potent as the showers. German POWs received rations calculated to provide 2,500 calories per day minimum, in line with Geneva Convention standards that the Americans, unlike the Germans in their treatment of Soviet prisoners, actually followed. This was roughly equivalent to what American rear echelon troops received, and it was more, often substantially more, than German combat soldiers had been eating for years. The rations came in cans: Spam, corned beef, beans, fruit cocktail, condensed milk, coffee, real coffee, not the burnt barley and acorn substitute that had become standard in Germany. There was chocolate. There were cigarettes, American cigarettes with white paper and real tobacco, distributed so freely that prisoners could accumulate stockpiles. There was white bread, soft and sweet in a way that German rye could never be, made from wheat that came from Kansas and Nebraska in quantities so vast that it could be given to enemy prisoners, while American soldiers complained it was too boring and demanded more variety. A German private named Joseph Schultz, captured near Bastogne, later wrote in his diary, "On the third day they gave us stew from a tin can. It had meat in it, real meat, chunks of beef, not gristle or fat but actual meat. I had not tasted such meat since 1942. My friend Wilhelm began to cry. Not from gratitude, but from anger. He kept saying, 'Where did it come from? Where did it all come from?' We had been told for years that the Americans were starving, that their ships were being sunk, that their factories were being bombed, that they were on the verge of collapse. And here was beef in a can, handed out to prisoners, handled carelessly by guards who smoked cigarettes and tossed the butts away half-finished. The wealth was obscene. It made us realize we had been lied to about everything. The realization came in layers, each one stripping away another article of faith. The first layer was material, the recognition that American abundance wasn't propaganda, it was observable fact. The second layer was systemic, the understanding that this abundance wasn't accidental or temporary, but the product of an industrial machine operating at a scale that had no parallel in human history. The third layer was ideological, and this was the one that caused the most disorientation. If the material superiority of democracy was this overwhelming, what did that say about the philosophy they'd been fighting for? What did it mean that the mongrel nation, the racially mixed society, the undisciplined democracy had outperformed the disciplined, racially pure, ideologically unified, right, not just marginally but categorically. For many German soldiers, this question was unanswerable, too threatening to their sense of self to be examined directly. They retreated into excuses. Germany had been outnumbered, Germany had fought on too many fronts, Germany had been betrayed by weak allies or incompetent leadership. But for others, the question festered. They had been taught that hardship created strength, that suffering built character, that deprivation was the forge in which superior men were made. The Americans had experienced none of these things, and they had won. They had won so decisively that they could afford to shower their prisoners, to feed them beef from a can, to treat them not as hated enemies but as a logistics problem to be solved with characteristic efficiency. The American guard who handed you a chocolate bar wasn't making a gesture of compassion. He was following a manual, implementing a system, participating in a machine so vast that individual kindness or cruelty was irrelevant. And that machine had crushed the German army not by matching its hardness but by rendering hardness obsolete. The shower trucks continued their route through the Ardennes, processing prisoners, servicing frontline units, maintaining the hygiene standards that kept the American army healthy and combat effective. They would continue operating through the final months of the war, through the crossing of the Rhine, through the dash across Germany, through the discovery of the concentration camps where the machinery of genocide had operated with the same thoroughness that the Americans applied to logistics, but in the service of an ideology that had mistaken cruelty for strength. When American soldiers entered Buchenwald and Dachau and Bergen-Belsen, they found mountains of corpses and walking skeletons and meticulously kept records of extermination, and they understood finally what they had been fighting against. Not just an army, but a philosophy that had inverted every human value in the service of power. The German prisoners who had laughed at American showers would eventually learn what their government had done in their name. Some would refuse to believe it, would insist it was Allied propaganda, would carry their denial to their graves. Others would be forced to confront it directly, marched by American commanders through the camps to see the evidence with their own eyes, to smell the smell that no propaganda could fabricate, to understand that the same system that had failed to provide them with socks had somehow found the resources to murder millions. And in that confrontation, the shower would take on yet another layer of meaning. It would become the symbol of the chasm between two civilizations, one that used its abundance to sustain life, and one that had bent all its discipline and organization toward death. There is a photograph, taken sometime in February 1945, that captures something essential about this moment. It shows a German prisoner, young, perhaps 19 or 20, standing in front of an American shower truck. He is wrapped in a U.S. Army towel, his hair wet, his expression unguarded in a way that soldiers' faces rarely are. He is not smiling, but he is not hostile either. He looks tired, confused, and, this is the remarkable thing, clean. Behind him, partially visible in the frame, is an American soldier, a sergeant from the Quartermaster Corps, smoking a cigarette and checking something on a clipboard. The sergeant is black, and this too is part of the story, because the German soldier has almost certainly never been this close to a black man before, has been raised on a diet of racial theory that classified such men as subhuman, and yet here he is, clean and fed and alive, because that black sergeant and thousands like him kept the supply lines running that made American victory inevitable. The photograph was published in Stars and Stripes, the American military newspaper, with a caption that read simply, "Processing POWs, Ardennes Sector." It was routine, unremarkable, one of thousands of such images documenting the massive administrative task of managing captured enemy soldiers. But in its ordinariness lies its power. This was not a special occasion. This was not propaganda. Or rather, it was propaganda so confident that it didn't need to exaggerate. The message was simple and devastating. This is normal for us. This is what we do. This is the baseline standard of how we operate. And you, with all your discipline and sacrifice and ideological certainty, cannot match it. You never could. By May 1945, over 8 million German soldiers were in Allied custody, the vast majority held by American and British forces. They were processed through a system that fed them, housed them, provided medical care, and eventually repatriated most of them within a few years. The system was not perfect. There were abuses, mistakes, failures of both policy and character. But it was fundamentally humane in a way that the German treatment of Soviet POWs had not been, in a way that the Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners had not been. This was not because Americans were morally superior as individuals. War brings out brutality in all people. It was because the American system, for all its flaws, was built on a foundation that recognized certain rights as universal, and that foundation was strong enough to hold even under the stress of total war. The shower trucks were decommissioned after the war ended, sold as surplus or scrapped for parts. The men who operated them went home to Cincinnati and Seattle and Des Moines, back to lives where hot water was so ordinary as to be beneath notice. The German soldiers who had been processed through those mobile bath units also went home, to a country that had been bombed into rubble, divided by the victors, forced to confront the magnitude of its crimes. Many of them carried for the rest of their lives the memory of that moment when they had laughed at American softness and then slowly, painfully, come to understand that what they had mistaken for weakness was actually a form of strength they had no vocabulary to describe. In the decades after the war, as Germany rebuilt and eventually became one of the most prosperous nations in Europe, the generation that had fought would sometimes talk about their experiences. And when they talked about the moment they realized the war was truly lost, not just militarily but philosophically, they often returned to small, specific details. Not the massive bombing raids or the walls of tanks or the waves of aircraft. Those were expected, comprehensible within the framework of military experience. It was the small things that broke through, the casual abundance, the systematic care, the sense that American soldiers were fighting an entirely different kind of war, one where the objective wasn't just to kill the enemy but to demonstrate that democracy, for all its apparent chaos and inefficiency, could outproduce and outlast any dictatorship because free people, given the tools and the choice, would choose to build rather than destroy. The shower, then, was not just a shower. It was a weapon, though not in any sense that would appear in a tactical manual. It was a weapon of conviction, a demonstration that the American promise, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, was not empty rhetoric but a functional organizing principle that produced tangible results. You could argue with propaganda, but you couldn't argue with hot water in a Belgian forest in January, with beef in a can, with systematic medical care for prisoners of war, with an abundance so vast that it could afford to be careless. The German soldier had been taught that strength came from deprivation, that hardness was the highest virtue, that sacrifice was the measure of worth. The American soldier proved that prosperity and power were not opposites but partners, that an army sustained by abundance fought harder and longer than one sustained by ideology alone. There is a final image worth holding: the steam rising from those shower trucks in the frozen forest, visible for miles in the clear winter air, a signal that could not be mistaken or misinterpreted. The soldiers who saw it from a distance, both American and German, understood what it meant. For the Americans, it meant normalcy maintained even in abnormal circumstances, the reassurance that the system was working, that someone somewhere had thought about their needs and delivered a solution. For the Germans, it meant the end of everything they had believed about the nature of war and strength and sacrifice. It meant that they had lost not just a battle or a campaign, but an argument about how the world worked, an argument they had been so certain of that they had bet their nation's future on it. The trucks would move on, following the army east into the heart of Germany, processing soldiers and prisoners until there were no more battles to fight. But the lesson they taught remained, carved into memory and consciousness, that the true measure of a nation's strength lies not in what it can endure but in what it can provide, not in how much suffering it can inflict or absorb, but in how much life it can sustain and protect. The German soldiers who laughed at those shower trucks learned this lesson in the hardest way possible, through defeat and captivity and the slow, humiliating process of having all their certainties stripped away. And perhaps, in the end, That education was the most valuable thing America gave them. Not the hot water or the beef or the cigarettes, but the knowledge that there was another way to organize human society, a way that valued abundance over austerity, life over death, and the dignity of every person over the glory of the state. The showers rolled on through the winter of 1945, steam rising into the frozen sky, and the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion. And somewhere in that steam, in the clean men emerging from those rough wooden stalls, in the systematic care applied to even the enemy, was the real victory, not just the military triumph, but the vindication of an idea that had seemed soft and naive and doomed to failure, until it proved itself the strongest force on earth.